So, with the news covered, we now get to our main topic here on Mastering Dungeons. We are going to talk about Chapter 8 of the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide. Chapter 8, Running the Game. Good, good time to learn about running the game. And that's my first thought was running the game. Why is it Chapter 8? But it's sort of about running the game with everything except the rules, or at least that's how it begins. So let's dig in. What does Chapter 8 start with? It starts with this quote: "Rules enable you and your players to have fun at the table. The rules serve you, not vice versa. There are the rules of the game, and then there are table rules for how the game is played. For instance, players need to know what happens when one of them misses a session. They need to know whether to bring miniatures, any special rules you've decided to use, and how to treat a cocked die, a die that lands so that a face cannot be clearly read. These topics and more are covered in this chapter." And so I read that and I was like, okay, cool. Yeah, this is sort of what we were talking about, right? This is sort of, tell me not about the rules, but about why these things, why are these things important? What are some other things that I need to think about as a game master that I might not have thought about? And so we get this first section is called table rules. And as I'm reading it, I realized this dichotomy of wanting that and then not liking it when I get it. So for example, they talk about uh, table rules of fostering respect, avoiding distractions, and having snacks available. And in general, those are good advice. And that's something as a new DM might not think about. Oh yeah, I should foster respect at the table. I should find a way to avoid distractions. I should have snacks. That's sort of like avoiding distractions, right? People get hungry. If they can just reach out and grab something, but then they don't really say why it is good advice, but make strange dictums like hire a babysitter that may not be applicable or may just be like sort of condescending advice
Hmm.
even. When I read that, I'm like, did the person who wrote that actually have children or ever play with people with children? Because it's sort of like it's almost snarky,
Yeah,
although it's
it's
not
sort
meant
of
to be, I'm sure,
it
you
made
know.
me think of a game at Gen Con where the couple would just like constantly be off taking care of their kid. And the rest of us at the table were kind of
Right.
like, like, and I get why you might say hire a babysitter, but there's probably a better way to say this, Sean.
Right. You just say distractions can take away from the fun of a game.
Yeah.
They are best enjoyed when everyone can concentrate, being in character, participating in the choices, participating in the story. So take steps when possible to eliminate distractions. For example, having snacks at the table. Well, but to say hire a babysitter, I've played at tables where like everyone at the table is holding a child, and we were fine, right?
Hmm.
Because we understood that and we were able to avoid the worst distractions, right? I've
Hmm.
been at tables where the mother is breastfeeding at the table.
Hmm.
It went totally fine. Nobody cared, everybody was good. So, right, to make those very specific things,
Yeah.
we don't need that. We need to
Yeah.
understand the why,
Yeah.
not those. So, but throughout this chapter, I enjoyed most of this. I thought most of
Hmm.
this was good advice that new DMs or even DMs who've been doing this for a while might need to hear, because every game is different. So hearing from a different perspective is often illuminating.
Yeah, you know what it made me think of is how Van Richten's had that really good advice on running games. I think it was Van Richten's, and that kind of session zero type information. I remember that being a lot better in terms of how it was written, how it portrays that, how it imparts that information, and the why of
Mhm.
it. And I think that's what I'd like to
Mhm.
see here is sort of a revisiting of this. But yeah, it's all nice content, and I think the main thing I found myself thinking is why wasn't this chapter 1? Why would you
Mhm.
put this
Yeah.
halfway through, especially this initial section that's talking about how to run a gaming session and all of that. Like, I just think that should have come in earlier, which they did say they're going to move to be
Yeah.
earlier.
Right. And I think it comes down to this was probably added almost second, as an afterthought. Like, oh yeah, we should do these things. So like one person or maybe two people were like, okay, well in my games I know that speaking in and out of character is an important thing. So I'm going to mention it here without really sourcing more
Hmm.
people to get a feel for that. Whereas with Van Richten's, it was probably really thought of carefully and designed like a game would be designed, where somebody writes it, people look at it, people add their advice
Hmm.
and build up. And we've learned a lot since 2014 to when Van Richten's was released to now.
Yeah.
So this chapter could have been session 0, right? This chapter could have been starting a game, session 0, and it could have been arranged in such a way that it managed to get the advice across in a way that was more resounding with new or even a veteran game masters.
And I'll say that there is a danger here, Sean, that when you focus on the prescriptive advice, but you're not explaining the why of it, you can end up being dated,
Hmm.
right? Like you talked about this time change
Hmm.
and how over the years we've developed better and better techniques, but the techniques are based on the problems. And we're constantly trying to solve and improve and be better about these problematic situations, these challenges, but whatever we prescribe, may or may not be best. So like later when they talk about initiative, they talk about like, oh, whiteboards and things like that. And all I can think of is you guys are kind of prescribing the solutions that were used in third edition that were popular, right?
Hmm.
Everybody would buy the Paizo initiative tracking board and use that. And that is what, but what is it we're trying to do with efficiency around initiative, right? We're trying to cut down on the wait, whose turn is it? Or, you know,
Hmm.
Susan, it's your turn. Oh, it's my turn. Oh, I didn't. Oh, let me see what my character sheet has because I wasn't prepared that So, how do we do that? How do we give cues? How does everybody know when their turn is coming up? Why are we doing these various things, right? That kind of the why of it can then ground people in developing their own solutions too, right? But
Hmm.
also, it helps teach that you want to improve over time. And that's something that this sort of whole chapter, I think, kind of misses really saying is think of all these subjects as things where you're going to develop your own methodology. Here are some things that work, but you want to
Hmm.
choose your own approach because this is not a done science. It's an evolving thing, and you want to find your way of doing it.
Yeah. And we can get right into some of these sections to highlight what Teos is talking about, which is like table talk was the first subsection. And it says, set expectations about how players talk at the table. First bullet, make it clear who's speaking, the character or the player speaking out of character. Why does it matter? What's the problem that you, new
Mhm.
DM, or existing
Right.
DM, are going to come up against for this? Uh, Decide how you feel about a player sharing information that his or her character wouldn't know, or that the character is incapable of sharing as a result of being unconscious or dead or not in the situation where the other players are. Are you all right with players retracting what they said their character did? Right. And so these are great bits of advice. Why?
Mhm.
Why would a character retract what they just said their character did?
Yeah.
Why would that come up? Me as a new DM, I would never know that.
Right. Right.
And so, breaking down that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so many things where like taking back can be something that a problematic player will do to you deliberately if you allow them to do it. But
Mm.
most
Yep.
players are being entirely reasonable and they're going like, "Ooh, I missed that factor. Is it all right if I change this?" Yeah, of course it is. You know, if the character would have known, then great, right? But how to
Right.
analyze that and think through it and what's behind it. And part of it is there's a whole missing part here about reading the player and reading the table, right?
Hmm.
Understanding where that person is coming from is a big part of it. This is friendships. This is relationships, right? There's a lot of
Hmm.
respect that's taking place in role playing games. We're sharing experiences. There's vulnerability, and so a lot of these things around table talk, you want to understand that, right? And kind of help create a really cool
Hmm.
environment. And those are the kind of things that I feel like other books have done a better job of speaking to this type of approach of honoring those other people at the table and creating a really good, healthy relationship versus just, bullet point things you do.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. Uh, then we get into the dice rolling, which is sort of funny. And it says, establish expectations around dice rolling. That's yes, absolutely. Uh, it's something that you, if you're playing with a group over the years, you do this automatically, or you do it systematically over time. But if you're playing with a group at a convention, or you're establishing a new group, and situations come up where you're the DM and you decide to hide a roll after you've been rolling out in the open, players might say, "Why? What just
Hmm.
happened there?" Um, a good discussion on fudging rolls and why you might want to, why you might not want to. This is where they actually do a good job of saying,
Yeah.
here is what this means. This is why you might want to. This is why you might not want to. You make the call in the long run.
Yeah. And the
So
different things that,
I
how it
enjoyed that.
impacts. Yeah, they do a nice job. You're right. They really do a nice job of that,
Yep.
of saying, the role behind the screen creates mystery. Out of the open
Hmm.
can create tension, all that sort of thing. And those are really good pieces. And overall, I mean, I think this is all pretty valuable. But there's some things that I think, like this next piece, rolling attacks and damage, rolling at the same time. In the end, it's sort of like this gets to there's a whole thing that's really around the larger topic of pacing and what to do
Hmm.
about it. And I think that if you say to everybody, "Hey, let's do this," okay, fine, but I generally don't do that. I roll them separately, but I don't also delay it significantly with my way of doing it. Um,
Right.
it's sort of like address things, how to address things or how to think about the impacts is maybe better spent than these specific examples because I think it kind of leads you astray maybe on what the solution to anything is.
Yeah.
I'll tell you, I mean,
Right.
to me, if you were
It
going to
sounds
add a
like
thing
this.
here, you do not need to have the exact number of dice to make a roll. I
Mhm.
think that's my pet peeve when
Right.
somebody wants, 19 D6s and everybody in the convention center needs to pull out an individual D6 instead of just rolling 19 times. That's my pet peeve.
Mhm.
It doesn't actually deserve being in here either.
No, one of the things that I always mention when this question comes up of, I've been at tables where the DM says, you know, I I roll to hit. Oh, I hit. I start rolling my dice, and they're like, why don't you roll them at the same time? And I'm like, well, I can, but if I roll them at the same time and I know I missed, but I did a lot of damage, that's when metagaming
Mhm.
starts to come in, where I'm like, oh, wait, let me see if I can find that extra +1 on my
Mhm.
uh what's the first level cleric spell that does 46 damage. It's the radiant bolt or guiding bolt,
Guiding bolt.
right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, my guiding bolt. Like, oh, I needed a 12 to hit. I got an 11, but oh, I rolled 4 6s. All right,
Mhm.
wait, do I have Bardic Inspiration? Does anybody have
Right.
any way I could get the actual? Whereas if I roll it and I just miss and it's like 4 1s, I'm like,
Yep.
I don't even want to bother. So
Yep.
there are things about rolling that do come into play if you do that,
Yeah.
that you might not want. So, that sort of thing needs to, if you're going to address it, address the full range
Yeah. Get to
of
the larger
questions.
topic, right? Yeah, yeah.
Right. What about rules discussions? They talk about rules discussion. And again, I think this is for a new DM, I think this is strong. Some people love discussing the rules at the table. Some people tolerate it. Some people hate it because they
Yeah,
want to
that's
get to
good.
the story. The only thing I would have added to this discussion is if you are having a rules discussion that's going on too long, take the time to finish it only if it's something that's going to come up repeatedly. If it's something you're going to have to stop and think about every other round, then just take the time to get it right this time. If it's something that's just a one-off, then you can say, well, this is what my ruling is. We'll come back to it later. What was your take on the metagame thinking? Any thoughts on that? Because this is, I feel like this is a topic that could have a whole chapter in a book.
Yeah.
And we could have whole episodes on what metagame means, because it's constantly seen. Sorry, I'm going to continue. It's constantly seen as a negative, or not constantly, but often when it's brought up, it's like, oh, it's a metagamer. Oh, you're metagaming. And we don't stop and think about the good things that metagaming does for your game,
Yeah.
because it is a game.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the experience, and so I think what I would probably say is that you a hard and fast rule would be problematic to the enjoyment, because people do want
Mhm.
to sometimes have those kinds of discussions, and it's okay to do that. If it's happening a lot, or it's destructive, or if there's a situation where you know really wanted to get into it, then I think this sort of advice, like where they say here of saying, what do your characters think, right? That's what it prescribes here. That's great. Like, that's the
Mhm.
right idea, right? Like, yeah, you're doing a lot of analysis, but okay, you've got to make a decision. Your character has to make a decision now before the blah happens. What do they do? Right?
Mhm.
What would your
Yeah.
character do? That kind of thing. That's good. And you just but in general, it's not a huge problem in most situations, right? And so, yeah.
Right. And in many cases, at least in my experience, it's good when a player knows their character, when a
Mhm.
player knows what their best thing is. How many times have you or me or someone else tried to teach new players the game, and you put a character sheet in front of them and explain all the things they can do and they're good at? You're a wizard. You can cast these spells that can burn things from a distance so that you are in no danger while the fighter's up there taking on all the risk. And then the player is faced with the beholder or the whatever, and I have a crowbar. Well, I'm going to run up and hit it with my crowbar. And you can say, all right, but the metagame there is the understanding of what you're good at, and you want the players to know that.
Yeah.
You want the game to work the way the game is intended to work. So there are different levels of metagaming, and I wish that this had sort of engaged with that
Mhm.
discussion, because it's important to let DMs know that there are many different ways to play,
Yeah.
and not it's not right or wrong, it's just your preference. So you want to work with everyone's preference
Yeah.
to get the experience that pleases the most people.
Agreed.
uh they talk about missing players and how to handle that. And again, I think this was great. I think this hit all the highlights. Either have another player run the PC, have the DM run the PC that's missing, just decide the character's not there, make up a story reason, or assume the character's there but really doesn't participate unless it's super important that they have some input into the story or the game. And what it doesn't discuss, though, is how do you handle XP, treasure, and other rewards for that missing player when they come back? Do they get all the experience? Do they have a share of the treasure? How? Just a brief discussion on that would help, because it is a point of contention for some people.
True.
Uh, so, and they had information on small groups, what to do, playing multiple characters, good advice there, and bringing in new players. Some halfway decent advice. Doesn't
Yeah.
necessarily go as deep as it could to explain
Mhm.
some tricks of bringing in new players, some some of the pitfalls, but it's there. It's
Yeah,
okay.
serviceable. Yep.
Yep. Next, we get a section called the roll of the dice and what the dice mean to the game. Dice are neutral arbiters. They can determine the outcome of an action without assigning any motivation to the DM and without playing favorites. The extent to which you use them is entirely up to you. And I want to set this down in front of every DM. I don't care how long you've been DMing. Even experienced DMs forget this sometimes. And they give a great example of if you're going to be a die roller, you're going to have the players roll for everything. This is what it means. If you're going to ignore die rolls and just make rulings, this is what it means. And then here's the middle ground. And I think they did a good job there of summing that up.
This whole section made me think about a recent article I read, which was a post that was sort of trying to look at the OSR and kind of it posits 7 maxims of the OSR. And I can't say whether these, it's because it's trying to say like, hey, the OSR being a relatively new thing doesn't have a real definition and is always fighting over sort of how to define itself. And it kind of goes over different statements that are often made, maxims that are made, and how they come together. And I can't say whether these are accurate for OSR or not, or properly done, but they're really fascinating to read from a perspective of game design and game evolution. And they do things like talk about, role playing versus role playing, and to what extent the what is the role of dice in the game when you're trying to create this sort of old style feeling. Really fascinating things, and reading this section I thought was actually helped by that recent article that I'd read, or the article that I'd recently read, because I think this is another case where the DMG is trying to play a bit across the editions and please all kinds of people, right? It's giving very flexible, good advice that it's easy to forget how many styles there are. And this whole chapter, I think, does a pretty good job of speaking to different ways to run the game. And it's a thing that's easy to forget because we have our style, But yeah, and this is another where it really talks about, hey, rolling can be exciting, but rolling can also then take away from your creativity. So to what extent should you solve the problem with, uh, pushing the mule that's been carrying your stuff in front to perhaps shield you from the trap versus making a check to disarm it, right? How much is it you coming up with a clever ploy versus just rolling dice to solve it away? And that middle ground. And so I thought this spoke really well to that. I liked this section.
Yeah, the using ability score section, which is next, does sort of that same thing, where it sets that age-old maxim of figure out if what the character's trying to do is impossible or just super easy, and don't roll dice then, because that doesn't do any good for anyone. But if either is true, that it's possible but not easy, then that's where dice come in. And only when the outcome is in question should a roll be called for. And even then, you might not need to do it. And it gets into like the heart. This section spoke to me as I try to design games, which is multiple ability checks. Do you let characters try an unsuccessful ability check again? Yes or no? Why or why not? Are there times when they should and times when they shouldn't? Or should it just be one or the other? And it gets to a point that I've been thinking about a lot, which is a macro versus micro check is what I call it, and how that leads to story. So you have a situation where the characters are trying to get into a walled city, but you need permission to enter. So they try to bluff their way in. And the Bardi character goes up with the high deception check and says, I am here at the behest of the mayor of this city, and we are close friends. Okay, give me a deception check. Oh, I fail. Okay. How do we handle that? How does that go from a game mechanic to a story? A micro thing
Mm.
is, all right, we're just going to then go to a different gate and we're going to try the same thing again. Or somebody else is going to step up and tell another story. Or that's the micro. The macro is just assume that how we are going to tell the story is changed because of this one check. There is no way that you or anyone else in your party is talking their way in. And so we can just move past that. We can play that out, we can give that its due, and then that's done. Come up with a new plan.
Mhm.
And if a game can be one or the other, if all games need to have room for both, is a question that's constantly on my mind these
Yeah.
days.
Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. And you noted here in the notes too, where they talk about contests and the idea where if you have both sides roll, they don't really dive into how big a difference this is to have two sides rolling versus one side rolling against a stable number. It makes
Mhm.
for a very wild response, right? To two swingy dice, both being rolled with a huge range of what can
Mhm.
possibly happen, right?
Yeah. And that's where we get, the contest between the arm wrestling match between the wizard and the barbarian,
Hmm.
where the barbarian is +7, the wizard is -1. And if it's just the barbarian going up against the wizard, then they're shooting for a DC 11. So you have whereas if that other die roll comes in, anything could happen. You're going to get a much more, you have a better chance for a surprising result, which some people, that's what they want. And but a lot of people, they don't want that surprising result. If it's, instead of this arm wrestling match, it's the goblin guard with the +0 to their perception check trying to see you as you stealthily approach, then you don't necessarily want that swinginess.
Yeah.
That's where you get the rogue with the +12 to their stealth check failing more because they roll low, goblin rolls high, and they are being seen.
Yeah, and they do some nice jobs of trying to talk about, yeah, the opening a door kind of situation that's similar to that, where the high strength barbarian may or fighter may roll poorly, but the rogue does well. They also do a nice job of explaining the difference between intelligence and wisdom that comes up often, and giving these comparisons around finding a secret door. What'd you think of that?
Yeah, that again speaks to a problem with the game
Mm.
that has never been successfully addressed, which is, all right, it's two different checks to find the secret door. It's the perception check to notice that this section of the wall is a different color than the others, and then an intelligence check to figure out what that means. It's fine to say, well, this is our game and this is how this game works. But as soon as that perception check is made, the character with the low intelligence doesn't matter because they've already found the thing.
Hmm.
And now the player is smarter than the character, so the player knows what that means.
Yeah.
The other characters and players are smarter than this high wisdom, low intelligence character, so they know what it means. So really, it has nothing to do with intelligence. It's just that wisdom check that matters. And the game has never, and maybe will never, address that, uh, because they it tries to make it something more complicated and more realistic than it really is, which is, if you make the wisdom check or the investigation check, if you make the wisdom perception check or the intelligence check, you're finding it. It's just the way it is. And it's okay if that's the way the game is. Just
Right.
admit that's the way the game is.
Yep.
Don't try to make it more simulationist,
Mm.
right, like real life, than it needs to be.
Yeah. Agreed.
So any thoughts from you on that, or
No, I mean, I think
tell me why I'm wrong, Teos?
no. The ability scores are a little close together in some cases, particularly intelligence and wisdom, and
Right.
you can combine them, but then you only have 5 ability scores, or you separate them, and sometimes it's a little arbitrary. The game clearly, we talked about this with the player's handbook. It doesn't really know how stealth and traps should work. There is an answer
Right.
there, but it is confused itself on it. I would not bet that they're going to solve this in 2024, because again, that it should be it should be less prescriptive and more about understanding the overall thing that you're trying to do, and it's not what's the point of the secret door is the real question here, and not, to me, intelligence wisdom. I think this is
Mhm.
a fine way to explain some differences between intelligence and wisdom. That's what I like about this. It's not how you should set up secret
Mhm.
doors. And that goes to the question
Right.
of, why did you put a secret door here? That's your goal, right? Like, why is a trap here? Why is a thing here? Then make that experience, build that experience, and make it so it's rewarding, and it's less about these 2 ability
Mhm.
scores.
Yes, you're right. Noticing a thing though is such an important part of the game that it's still problematic. It's still,
Sure.
um, regardless of whether it's a secret door or a hidden goblin guard or something. There's always this. The player is always going to want to
Yeah.
use their highest stat,
Yeah.
understandably.
The description here is a little bit like, oh, the player, with the high wisdom notices a clear spot on the wall, but doesn't know what to make of it. And the intelligent person
Mhm.
doesn't see it, but if they were to see it, would go, oh, it's clear. If it's pointed out to them, goes, oh, it's all clean like that. Well, maybe it's a secret door. When the reality is, the players are just gonna be smart enough to go like, wait, a cleared section of the wall, we're gonna go mess with it. Now, what you can do in
Yeah.
terms of the stepwise progression to make it sort of more interesting and have steps to it is to say, like, yeah, you found it, and when you make this investigation check, you realize what the trigger is that opens it, that might be across the room, or and that could be fun to say, like, well, it's the suit of armor that you have to move its arm, and if someone investigates the suit of armor, they would also find it that way, or so it can be just,
Mhm.
you can find ways to make it interesting, but you want to start with that design question of, why am I even putting this here, and what's the point of it? And it can be fun to show A B relationships, right? That the suit of armor, when you lift its arm, opens the secret door, can be fun. The chair, when you sit on it,
Yeah.
triggers the revolving door, like in Indiana Jones Last Crusade, can be a ton of fun because they might just sit on it, and there could even be something that
Mhm.
suggests sitting. And so part of the fun may be they may just do it without even searching, or it could be that they search it out and something must open this door. What is it? Let me sit and think about it.
Mhm. Yeah. Ba-dum. Yes, I agree. It's a fun part of the game, but it's also rules wise a frustrating part of the game to design well, to have it transfer from the game to a story. Um,
Yeah.
anyway, next we get sections on attack rolls, saving throws, and difficulty classes. Attack rolls pretty much say, hey, you roll this die, you add your bonus, and that's what an attack roll is. And you can also use an attack roll for non-combat activities like archery or dart contests. And my first thought was, that's really awkward. Uh, I have seen so many games. I've edited probably 500 adventures, if not 1,000, and they'll say, "Oh, we have an archery contest. So characters, if they hit a DC 18, they hit the target, and
Yeah.
everyone in the place hits the target." And okay, that's so sometimes those you have to do it differently. You have to say, okay, who has the highest score, and they get a certain number of points, and you can mess around with that. But just to say, okay, yeah, just make an attack roll against AC 15 is not a good way to run
Yeah.
a contest like that.
Yeah.
Uh, saving throws, they specify saving throws are when you are avoiding something as opposed to doing something. If you're doing something, probably an ability check is better. If you're trying to avoid something, then probably a saving throw is better.
Yeah, and then nice
And
job
then we
here
get
of
to the bane
breaking
of my
down.
existence.
They break down what each ability does and what you're usually saving against. So this is all good baseline stuff to know that,
Yeah.
again, would have been in chapter 1.
Yeah. Yeah. And then they get to the bane of my existence, which is this difficulty class chart where very easy is a DC 5, easy is a DC 10, DC 15 is moderate, and so on and so on. And I always get adventures where people are putting in DC 10 checks that are very important, especially at low level, that they're like, oh, well, it's easy, so everyone should make it. And everyone fails the check because DC 10 is, if you don't have a special training in the skill or an ability score that gives you a bonus, you have a 50% chance of failing something that's easy. Now, maybe it's just a matter of changing the names
Mhm.
from, make a DC 10 moderate and then go from there. But it is a very misleading name for these difficulty classes.
I think of these names as like the game of hacky sack, which when you see like good hacky sack players, these things are easy, yet the ball will be dropped. The hacky sack will be dropped, right?
Mhm.
Like
Yes.
you cannot keep it going forever. It's just going to happen, right? And that's sort of what these things are kind of like, which is different than what you think of when you think of the word easy. It's easy with a continual chance of failure, and oh, look at the D20, right? Like it causes these problems. Um,
Mhm.
I think the thing to me is that this needs that. Well, this is built very much around the fifth edition philosophy of representing the world, right? Should this thing
Mhm.
be easy or hard? And it's not looking at the gameplay of it. And some of my dearest friends, I have these questions all the time, right? Is rope always easy to climb, or does it depend on what you're doing, and how do you characterize that, right? And I think there needs to be that additional piece here that yes, the world can be this way, but also what's the gameplay experience? Because maybe you don't actually want to check at all, or maybe you want the check to be
Mhm.
challenging, so think of how to explain that challenge so it feels right. The experience matters, and you need to have that in here to some extent.
Mhm. And the last thing we'll talk about today is proficiency, where it just simply gives you what was in the player's handbook, essentially, is that you're proficient with certain things. And so, therefore, you have a better chance of succeeding if you do something, whether it's an attack roll or a saving throw or an ability check. If you have proficiency, you will have a better chance of succeeding. And you, as the game master, should use your best discretion in figuring out what a proficiency might cover. They do, as Teo said, put these ability charts in to show you what each ability does, and the skills are pretty simple words that you can then uh, expand upon to say that since you are proficient in survival, although it doesn't necessarily say so, I'm going to say you are good at doing X, whatever X might be.
Yeah, there's a table I think they should have in this section, which they don't. To me, it's just as important as this typical DCs 5, 10, 15, 20, etc. And that is what you can expect at different levels of play that characters will have. And I think our minds are often, those of us who are older DMs especially, our minds are clouded by what it worked like in different editions, especially third edition, but fourth
Mhm.
edition as well, where you just automatically kind of got better at a bunch of things. And fifth edition,
Mhm.
if you are unskilled at level 1 and you just
Mhm.
have a 10 in the ability, at level 1, you have a +0 to the roll. At level 20, you have a
Mhm.
+0 to the roll. And it's so
Yes.
easy to forget that because the swing is fairly big. It's not as big as third edition of someone who's super skilled, but still, at 17th level, someone who has a +4 in their ability score and has expertise is +17, but the other person is
Mhm.
+0. So this really matters when you're doing things like everybody's supposed to get away by climbing up the wall and you make it really hard. Someone could fail for the rest of time.
Mhm.
And I'm that kind of player who'll roll
Right.
poorly in those situations. And so proficiency is a really great topic. I like what they say here. I like that they talk about tools, but they really should help DMs understand that the difference between unskilled, skilled, skilled in your primary class, expertise, those are
Mhm.
big differences. And it can be fine when you're thinking of like the trap that the person who is trained in your party who cares about this and wants a challenge should get,
Mhm.
or everybody has to climb the wall to get away from the dragon or get killed.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, I think we have covered the first section fairly well. We will try to get through the rest of this chapter next episode. Teos, thank you as always for sharing your expertise. I appreciate it. I hope that our patrons appreciate it too. And thank you, patrons, who help us make this show possible. Thank you to our Master of Dungeon supporters. We have a special shout out to our Master of Realms supporters in our show notes. And for the Masters of the Multiverse, well, you know that this is for you. Graham Ward, James Walton, Joe Tyler, Krishna Simone Say, Andy Shockney, Ross Sandberg, Chance Russo at Drago Russo, Post Fiction RPG Audio, Falcon Neil, Sean Molly, the Micro Ant, Eric Mengi, the Mathemagician, Chad Lench, Jim Klingler, aka DM Prime Mover, Brian King, Chad Jackson, Sean Hurst, Paige Lightman, and Ben Heisler, the Mighty Jerd, Andy Edmonds at Nerdronomicon, Seth Eckel, Darren Chandler, DM Chad, Evil John Carney, Merrick Blackman, Steve Bissonette, Craig Bailey, and Keith Ammon of The Monsters Know What They're Doing. Thank you to our listeners. If you do like the show, please consider supporting us on our Patreon at patreon.com/masteringdnd. Also, if you get a chance, leave us a review via Apple Podcasts because that helps us get noticed by other folks. And you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel if you watch there, because that helps make us more visible as well. Teos, where can people find you on the internets?
Find me at alphastream.org. You can also find me on Mastodon. I am working on two things as time allows that involve sort of fun collating of sort of data. One is the book scan set, and another is differences between Wizards of the Coast books editions and edits for inclusivity. And so both of them I'm having fun playing with, and at some point we'll release those and share those so people can learn from them. So I'm excited about that. Where we find you, Sean?
And you can go to AlphaStream. You can go to alphastream.org to get everything that Teos does. To get everything that I do, you basically have to come here. Although you can go follow me on Twitter at Sean Merwin. I'm on Blue Sky now. I'm on Mastodon at Dice Camp. We're on YouTube. We're on Patreon. You know where to find us. If you just search Mastering Dungeons, you're gonna find all the good stuffs. So Teos, now that we are halfway through this chapter on running your game, what are we going to do now?
Well, I'm going to remind myself that my life always, Sean, has really been about the digital experience.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I'm going to go fail miserably several times at doing an easy task.